Okay, David, have we got our, here we are. Oh yeah, I shouldn't, okay, no, I don't have to move the mic. Okay, everyone, let's get started. For those of you who are watching at home, I think we're going to start trying to get going on Slido. I think we're going to start trying to answer some, are we going to try and do, seems to be hard to find time for all of this. Okay, everybody, we're going to be late for supper if we don't get started. So let's not be late for supper. Call me what you like, but don't call me late for supper. That's right, exactly. So, okay. Let everybody get their seats, and I walked up here without my agenda. Our next speaker is Michelle Sterling. We're talking about, is it science or is it science fiction? And so Michelle Sterling has become an absolute, I guess, one of our a treat at our conferences, and we're looking forward for what she has to say. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Sterling, and then we'll get on with our agenda. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of Freedom Talk for inviting me to be here today. My topic of the day is carbon tax to stop climate emergency. Is that science or science fiction? I'd like to mention one thing before we get too far into this, and that is there was some talk previously about some of the challenges that Alberta faces, and I think that people should read the Nemeth reports, which are part of the Alberta inquiry, and we have them posted on our blog for Friends of Science. Now, I do want to say that I am not representing Friends of Science today, even though I'm quite associated with them. This is my personal point of view, and so I will probably be drawing on some materials that I have acquired during my time working with Friends of Science, but these are my own personal views. So let's look at the mandate letter of the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. So in the letter of January the 15th, 2021, part of the letter reads, "To be ready for what lies ahead, our government must continue to be agile and use the best available science and evidence. Canadians are counting on us to ensure that today's policies, programs, and services are calibrated and targeted to match their needs. Therefore, I, being the Prime Minister, expect you, being Minister Wilkinson, to uphold our ongoing commitment to delivering real results and effective government for the people we are elected to serve. We remain committed to evidence-based decision-making that takes into consideration the impacts of all policies on all Canadians and fully defends the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms." And if we go to the next slide, we can see the mandate letter to the Minister of Climate Change and Environment from December the 13th of 2019. It reads, "I also expect us to continue to raise the bar on openness and effectiveness and transparency in government. This means a government that is open by default. It means better digital capacity and services for Canadians. It means a strong and resilient public service. And it also means humility and continuing to acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect, but they expect us to be diligent, honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest." So I hope you'll keep those things in mind as I go through the material in my presentation. And so the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what if a government's science is out of date or skewed? What if economic assumptions on carbon taxes are off? And what happens when the science relies on a singular theory with no public debate or cost-benefit analysis of the proposed objectives? So let's look at the Paris Agreement. What if the countries even managed to meet their Paris Agreement targets, which most of them are completely missing? all their targets. Could you go back one? Thank you. So you'll see in the corner there, the graph is from Bjorn Lomborg. He's a Danish economist and climate policy analyst, and he's worked with hundreds of economists and scientists building the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He used the IPCC's favored magic model, and he found that if all the countries met their targets by 2030, the resulting reduction in warming by 2100 would be 0.05 degrees Celsius. And if they all continued to meet their targets, then by 2100, there would be 0.17 degrees Celsius reduction in warming. So that's 17/100ths of a degree, which is immeasurable. And the costs for that would be $1 to $2 trillion per year. So, when it's this obvious that these are flawed policies and it's a flawed agreement, why would governments pursue such obviously ineffective and expensive goals? Well, it's because in the climate world, the reference point is what's known as the RCP 8.5 scenario, even though that's the least likely, and it's based on hopelessly out-of-date science. And we're not on that catastrophic pathway. So how can it be that a government or a society goes completely off the rails on a scientific question? Has it ever happened before? Well, yes, in the 60s, there was a thing called polywater, and polywater was discovered in the Soviet Union, and it appeared to be a kind of water that wouldn't freeze. And there became kind of a contest between the States and Russia for a short time, where people were trying to create their own polywater, almost like a space race. And engineers speculated that it might be good as antifreeze, and others were afraid that it would escape the lab and maybe melt all the ice caps and cause a disaster. Sound familiar? Anyway, they found out that it was just an error in the lab. There wasn't such a thing as polywater, but it had its own life and really took off, captured the imagination of thousands of people. And an example in medical research, what could that be aside from, well, we heard about COVID, and that would be, this is from Roger Pielke Jr.'s article, which I will go into further, but in the opening of it, he says, a 2015 literature review found almost 900 peer-reviewed studies published on breast cancer using a cell line derived from a breast cancer patient in Texas in 1976. But in 2007, it was confirmed that the cell line was actually a skin cancer line. Oops. A cursory search of Google Scholar indicates that the studies continued to be published until 2020, mistakenly using the skin cell in breast cancer research. So it does happen. It's not unusual. But the RCP 8.5 scenario, the scary catastrophic scenario, has proliferated largely because two green billionaires and a bunch of climate activists proliferated this report called Risky Business, wherein the RCP 8.5 became sort of known as the business as usual scenario, making everyone think, oh, there's a climate catastrophe coming. Now, if we look at that, if you look at the chart there, you can see how these RCPs, this is a representative concentration pathway, and there's scenarios that use different inputs, like what if we burnt up all the coal in the world? That would be the RCP 8.5. And we did it without any climate policy, with no mitigation. Well, that's just not going to happen. But that's how that scenario shows up. And then there's these other RCP scenarios where it's like, well, what happens if we had fewer people on the planet? Then what would it be? You can see the historical area where we are now. We're nowhere near the RCP 8.5. And you can find that Roger Palke Jr. and a fellow named Justin Ritchie from BC, if you can believe it, from Green, BC, they put together a paper. They did a literature review, and they found almost 17,000 peer-reviewed papers use the now outdated highest scenario emissions, RCP 8.5. And that particular scenario is also most commonly cited in government documents, in the IPCC, and in the US National Climate Assessment. And every day, new papers are published using that RCP 8.5 as the climate catastrophe scenario, even though it's completely wrong. And also the authors say that the representative concentration pathways are supposed to be a plausible, comprehensive, integrated, and consistent description of how the future might unfold, while refraining from a concrete statement on probability. So this is not the crystal ball. And might, as Dr. Moore said, might doesn't mean it will happen. So one of the interesting things that Ritchie and Palke found is that peak carbon emissions were probably reached in 2019. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but you can see that the least likely, most published scenario is the top one, and yet the most likely scenarios are the bottom ones, and that's where we are now. So we're nowhere near that catastrophe. And this kind of research is quite new, but it's not getting any headlines. You'd think people would be dancing in the streets. Yay, there's no climate emergency. We're all happy, aren't we? You know, our kids don't have to be scared anymore. But it continues. So this is the cover of that document that Palke and Ritchie wrote. And one of the things that they have pointed out is that these RCP scenarios are not to be compared to each other because all of the assumptions are completely different. And it's scientifically misleading and methodologically wrong to compare one to the other. But if we look at it at Environment Canada's Changing Climate Report, what do we find? Well, comparisons everywhere. So the really hot, bright red one, that's the big emergency one, RCP 8.5. But these are not to be used this way. They should not be compared. They should not be used for policy making. These are not options of how to get to a lower emissions scenario in the world. And you can find that even very famous climate scientists wrongly use these as comparisons. So this was from the University of Calgary. I attended a lecture by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe from Texas Tech. She's actually a Canadian, and she and her colleague Ann Stoner wrote the Alberta Climate Future Report that was commissioned under the Alberta NDP government. Anyway, could you just go back? You can see that she's standing in the corner there, and she's comparing the RCP 8.5 scenario in the top with, you know, much a backlit emission shot showing how horrible fossil fuels are, and down in the corner the RCP 4.5 with a wind turbine as the solution. But again, they're not to be compared that way. They're not to be used that way. And in fact, from the authors of the RCP scenario, Van Vuren et al., they say that the RCPs should clearly not be interpreted as boundaries for possible developments with respect to emissions and land use. And they are also not meant to be policy prescriptive. Now, one thing that's very concerning to me is if we look at the next slide, there's been some talk today about depopulation and concerns about the ongoing effects of the COVID lockdowns and how many people are dying from lack of treatment, how many people are dying from unintended consequences, overdoses, suicides. One of the deeply concerning things is that some parties might misinterpret the fact that the other RCPs have 3 billion fewer people as part of the equation. And they might misinterpret that and say, oh, maybe we should have 3 billion fewer people on the planet. So you have to think that there are very powerful people like Bill Gates, like the World Economic Forum, who are using these kinds of scenarios to describe the climate emergency and the climate disaster. And they may also be misinterpreting these RCP scenarios as a policy decision-making tool, that there should be fewer people on the earth. When we look at Bloomberg Green, they recently published this article saying that the world is moving toward net zero because of a single sentence in the IPCC 1.5 report. Is that how science is done? A single sentence? And it's all based on these scenarios? The IPCC SR 1.5 report is also full of FOLO, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So this probably is where the sudden urge to plant billions of trees comes from. But this is a desperate effort to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is unnecessary and it's damaging, because carbon dioxide fertilizes growth, worldwide plant growth. And it also likely stems from the misuse of that RCP 8.5 scenario. There's the hope of planting trees, and there's another thing called BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture storage, in which they propose that farmers would plant switchgrass, then they would harvest it, the grass would be burnt for energy production, and the carbon dioxide would be sequestered in the ground. Like, why not just use fossil fuels? Because, you're wasting a lot of agricultural land, and actually biofuels were determined by the UN's own special rapporteur to be a crime against humanity. When there are still people starving in the world, why would you use biofuels? So the result is that millions of children are terrified, public policies have been turned upside down, and green cronies are capitalizing. And I just want to mention also, those green cronies are associated with an organization called the UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. This group is a voluntary group, as most of these things supposedly are, but they have about somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 signatories. They're mostly pension funds, institutional investors, and they have something like $100 trillion in assets under management. And they're all climate crazy, and their fiduciary guru is Al Gore. So these are some of the kinds of pressures in the background against the oil sands, and some of the reasons, I assume, why Premier Kenney has recently said that ESG will be part of oil sands investment, because you're trying to make peace with these people who have so much money and power, but they're very hidden. Like they're right out there in the open, but nobody knows much about them. Like the average people, and even business people. I've asked lots of business people, have you ever heard of the UNPRI? And they're like, oh, what's that? So it's something that you should look into. And what happens when there's bad policy? Oh, could you go back? So poor public policy has very deadly consequences, and we saw that in Texas last week. It's not just about renewables, it's about the fact that the market has been skewed there to the point where no one wants to invest in conventional backup anymore because it's not as profitable as wind and solar, where you can quickly put up a wind and solar farm, get the subsidies, get the tradable renewable energy certificates. So when people say, oh, well, that's the trend of the world, it's only because it's a quick cash grab, but that cash is coming from the pockets of citizens, and who in this case suffered, and many of them died because there was not sufficient conventional power. And when faulty science becomes state policy with no opportunity for open civil debate, millions suffer and die. This is from the book Tombstone, which looks at the Great Leap Forward and the disastrous famine that resulted. And you can see, probably not very clearly, but you'll be able to see on the PowerPoint how they're using the same language then against people who questioned the Great Leap Forward. So anyone who questioned the glorious achievement of a big harvest that didn't exist, they were called deniers. They were called doubters. And just as we see on social media, mobs would struggle the people. They would take the dissenting person, put them in a group, in a circle, where the person was pushed around from person to person till they fell to the ground, and they were kicked and beaten until they either submitted or died. So that's what happens when bad policy becomes state policy. Another example is the Lysenko affair. And Lysenko was one scientist, Trofim Lysenko, in the Soviet Union. And he, it says here, he probably killed more human beings than any other individual scientist in history, because he had very crazy ideas about genetics and plants. He managed to become the favorite of Stalin, and he managed to get his competitors, who actually were scientists with real rational views, he managed to get them sent to the Gulag or executed. And it took years and years until the Lysenko vision of science was disbanded, and they went back to some normalcy. So now I started off talking about carbon taxes. And so let's just go back to that for a moment. I think I've established early on that the science is skewed and outdated, and therefore it's unnecessary to have carbon taxes. But, you know, before April 20th, 2020, or April 1st, 2020, we were all paying $192 a ton carbon tax equivalent for fuel taxes. And if that didn't get you out of your car, do you think another $50 will? And if you look around the world, you find that in Norway, back in the 1990s, they had a very stiff carbon tax, but they found that it hardly reduced emissions at all. And they also introduced a carbon tax in Zimbabwe, if you can believe it, and it also wasn't ineffective. So if it doesn't work in these two very diverse countries, one of the richest, one of the poorest, why would it work here? Now, the other thing is, I wrote this before the federal government changed the law on carbon taxes and gave a reprieve to farmers. But I'm saying here, if the carbon tax means Canada's farmers cannot afford to pay for fuel, planting, harvest, grain drying, or cattle and dairy farming, well, who will feed you? So I gave two examples of famines, one being in the Soviet Union, one being in China. But farmers will still be affected by all the other carbon taxes, even if they're getting something of a reprieve. So Judith Curry in 2014 told the US Senate that carbon dioxide is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate. Therefore, of course, the carbon tax is irrelevant. And what can we learn from the story of Lysenkoism? Well, it's simple enough. It just requires that political authorities interfere in science by supporting the dubious scientific ideas of an individual or a group of individuals, and continue to do so without correcting the situation, even in the face of radical contradictions with reality, such as millions of deaths. So, since we reached peak carbon emissions in 2019, extreme climate policies like net zero 2050 are not necessary. Burdensome carbon taxes are ineffective, and there's no climate emergency. So since the environment minister's mandate is to use the best available science and to consider the impacts of policy on Canadians, it's time for a thorough review of present climate policy and rejection of those policies that will damage the economy, and especially the policies that hurt food production and harms the mental health of children. So although I am not presenting today as Friends of Science, I do want you to be aware of these two productions we recently did. One with Donna Laframboise, which shows how climate activists are undermining all of your freedoms, and the other one with Dr. Roy Spencer, which in which he explains why, the many reasons why there is no climate emergency. Those are sponsored content, you have to pay a fee to watch them or become a member wherein it's included. But I think they're both very plain language, straight up. Anybody can watch it and make sense of it. And finally, I want to read this long and kind of grim passage, but I think it's really important because when I look at the climate policies being enacted, this is what I see. I see catastrophe. I see famine based on historic issues. We're walking right off a cliff. And this is by Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize for economics. He wrote, "In the terrible history of famines in the world, no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a relatively free press. We cannot find exceptions to this rule no matter where we look. The recent famines of Ethiopia, Somalia, or other dictatorial regimes, famines in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, China's 1958 to 61 famine with the failure of the Great Leap Forward, or earlier still, the famines of Ireland and India under alien rule. China, although it was in many ways doing much better economically than India, still managed, unlike India, to have a famine, indeed the largest recorded famine in the world. Nearly 30 million people died in the famine of 1958 to 61, while faulty government policies remained uncorrected for 3 years. The policies went uncriticized because there were no opposition parties in parliament, no free press, and no multi-party elections. And indeed, it's precisely this lack of challenge that allowed the deeply defective policies to continue, even though they were killing millions of people every year. And just on one final note, we talked about the lockdowns today. The thing that's coming next is a climate lockdown. And people who write for the World Economic Forum have been sort of posing this, like, isn't it grand that emissions dropped this year by 8%? This is what they're more concerned about than the fact that people's lives were ruined. So then the UNEP is saying, well, every year for the next decade, we should drop emissions 7.6%. So what logical conclusion are these green ideologues going to come to? Climate lockdowns. And this economist named Mariana Mazzucato wrote about that in September of 2020, that will probably be the next thing that has to be instituted. So these are very serious consequences for all of society. On that note, I just want to thank you all for having me here today. And I hope that none of these horrible things happen. Thank you.
We have time for one question if you want me to just ask them. We have time for one question. Has anybody got one question? Yes, go ahead. It's got to be a short question.
Yeah, you temper your speech here with calling it Lysenkoism when it's pretty obvious this is Marxism. And I'm just wondering, why that is. We don't seem to be able to articulate what is happening in this country because no one's willing to say it. No one seems to have the political courage to come out and call a spade and talk about what's being done to us, whether it's bad science with COVID or bad science with the climate. Like, there seems to be intent here, and until we start talking about this honestly and calling what it is,
can I just say one thing first? Actually, Milan answers it in about a 200-page book, and he's right there at the table. He's quite well. Thank you, Jan, for holding it up. He talks about it very openly and honestly. So I'd recommend to get his book. There's the complete answer, but we'll let you give a short answer. That you don't have 170 pages to answer. Just go ahead.
Well, I didn't call it Marxism because Marxism isn't about science per se becoming government policy. Lysenkoism is, and it was in a Marxist context, but that's the direct connection to bad science and bad policy. I think if you read Dr. Tammy Nemeth's report for the Alberta Inquiry, there are 2 reports, read them both. She talks about a huge transnational progressive movement that is trying to move the entire world off oil. And actually, another thing that you should read in concert with that, Robert Lyman, who's a former public policy analyst and public servant in Ottawa for 27 years and a diplomat for 10 years, he just issued a new report called When Giants Arise. And if you're looking at the Paris Agreement, he's showing from PricewaterhouseCoopers a report that shows that 60% of the world's population in South Asia are going to be expanding the use of fossil fuels, and they're not going to be taking any advice from the what will be maybe 19 to 11% of us in the West on climate. So it's a ridiculous proposition. Anyway, I'll just leave you with that, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'll let you get off the stage and then I'll say a few things. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're just before we break. Dave, are you going to put up the number for the Slido? If you go to slido.com, it'll say participant code, and you can vote on some of the, John Robson is posting some of the referendum questions, but if you actually have a question for any one of the speakers, you can just put SP in front of your question, which means for the speakers, and then we will sort of vote on the questions that are coming up for the speakers. And so let's see if we can't get using the Slido. We've had a few little glitches with the online, with people not realizing that they had to click on morning session, noon session, afternoon session. So I think it's good now. So I apologize to anyone at home that's been inconvenienced. So we've got a 15-minute break, and then we'll no, actually we don't have a break right now. Actually, we have Rob Anders, and then we have a break. So Rob, here you are standing between us and our break. So let's have at it. Okay, thank you very much. Please welcome Rob Anders. Thank you.
Sadly, you'd probably prefer a break, and so would I, but anyhow, that's the way it goes. This is obviously a big subject. Ronald Reagan used to say every country has its own, or every country has a military its own or somebody else's. And this idea of the police or reserve force is central to this. I believe we should be collecting and spending taxes here in Alberta, but the follow-up to that is, what do we do in terms of enforcement of law, et cetera. So should Alberta have its own police? And I pose a second question with regard to its own reserve force. I point down, because I had some people talk to me at the table about this and in other contexts. What the RCMP did in High River, and I know Paul understands this well because he was there. I'm just going to tell you a little story in terms of how I interacted with that. I was in my office in Calgary West, my constituency office, and Paul Hamnett, who is a staffer of mine, who's a big gunny, contacted me or said to me, "Did you know that they're breaking down doors and taking guns, et cetera, et cetera?" And the first thing that came out of my mouth was, I said, "Who gave the order for that? Where did that come from?" And so we immediately contacted the Harper PMO and said, "Who gave the order for this? Was the authorization from the PMO? Where did it come from, et cetera, blah, blah, blah." And they knew that I'm kind of a apple cart upsetting rabble rouser kind of guy. So they got back to me very, very quickly. And they said, it didn't come from us. Okay, now, Paul and I can think about some of the provincial politicians and how this all came to be. But anyhow, somebody had to give that order. Okay, and I prefer in the future situation, if something like that's given, I want to know who gives the order. I don't want a confusion between whether or not it was the PMO or it was the Premier's office or some minister that went awry in the province of Alberta or whatever it was. I want clarity on that. Right, so I know where the buck stops and who gets blamed for it. But that was a tremendous violation of rights, without warrants, without going before judges, et cetera, to get this done. It was ridiculous. Well, I think the people who gave the order don't want to admit that they gave the order, but there's a couple ministers, I think, that take real blame for this in the province of Alberta, and due to liability issues, and because I'm on a public microphone, I'm not going to name them specifically, but there's a couple of people who really owe an apology for what happened there. Yeah, I'll leave it there. If you want to talk to me privately, I'll give you my thoughts on that. I'll also just say this. I remember we had a member of parliament who was the MP for the area, who contacted me and did not like at all that I was delving into this issue. And they said, basically, stay out of my backyard. And I said, this isn't just your backyard, buddy. I said, this affects the entire country. This is a terrible legal precedent. You know, the whole country suffers for this. Anyhow, I could go on and on. So we have 2800 RCMP. I want to point out that I know that this issue is having resonance. How do I know that? Because the RCMP union has now come out against having a provincial police force. You know you're getting traction when the people who are counting on the union dues are worried that they're going to be losing thousands of union dues, right? Okay, yeah, exactly. You know you're getting traction when. All right, so the current contract that we have allows an opt-out in Article 3.3, and so we could be free by March 31st, 2023, if the province of Alberta gives notice by March 31st, 2021. And you know that date's quickly approaching. Well, I'm with you. I'm making the case. So, well, yeah, that's a question for Mr. Kenny. That's a good question for Mr. Kenny. I'm supporting another party now, right, Mr. Hinman? Yeah. And so anyhow, we pay about 70%, okay, for this. Now, some municipalities, for the overall cost, we pay about 70%, okay. For the municipalities that are over 15,000 people, they pay 90%, okay. And for the new municipalities that are added onto this, they pay 100%. Okay, now Tom Flanagan's here. God bless you. Good to see you, sir. Best class I ever took in University of Biopolitics, Dr. Tom. He pointed out in some of the work that he's done, the investigations on this, that one of the things you'd avoid is the overhead with regard to bilingualism. Like there's a lot of things that happen with regard to the political correctness or the agenda in the RCMP that frankly don't really lead to its merit or its success. I'm going to give you an example. I know a guy who was a student at the University of Calgary. He was interested in becoming an RCMP officer. And the way it works is that if you're a white male who wants to write the exams, the initial exams, you have to get over 85% to move on to the next level. Okay, I support high standards. That's fine. Okay, but if you're a female, you get to write the exam, and as long as you get 70%, you move on to the next level. Right? And if you're Aboriginal of any sexual persuasion or inclination or whatever the nomenclature is these days, you have to just as 50%. That's real. That's real. That's absolutely real. Okay. Yeah, that's right. I feel like I'm an Aboriginal woman, right? Yeah, but you know what I'm saying? Like that's the reality. That's the reality, folks. So, you know, by having our own force, one would hope that we would be able to jettison some of the political correctness with regard to this and just focus on merit. Okay, so according to KPMG, their financial study they did in 2003, 2006, the cost was about $155,800 per RCMP officer. Just as a comparison, on the Ontario Provincial Police, they're looking at $148,200. The Sûreté du Québec is $138,000. You also have complaints about rural response times, quotas for females and visible minorities. We remember the whole brouhaha with regard to turbans in the RCMP, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's all the stuff that goes on when you have this federal force that has to cater to all sorts of aspects of the country, not just the province of Alberta. Okay, so let's look at history. Northwest Mounted Police operated here since 1874, and you know, a lot of the forts that we have that were established here in the province of Alberta were actually done by the Northwest Mounted Police, not the RCMP. It's a modern, you know, kind of affectation, if you will. Here you have some of the lads in their uniforms in 1902 posing, and so the badges and what have, the hats they wore, etc. And then when the government gets stressed, they often look to download services, and they say, well, you know, we're focusing on the war, so you guys look after yourselves. So during the First World War, of course, it started in 1914. By the time that they got to 1916, the purse was getting tight. So they said, okay, we're going to jettison this stuff and have the provinces look after their own problems, issues. So from 1916 to 1932, the feds wanted out of policing due to the war. And you had the Saskatchewan Provincial Police, you had the British Columbia situation all the way from 1858 up until 1950, so almost 100 years there. The Mounted Constabulary Force in Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI had their own, Newfoundland had their own ranger force. So you can see most of the provinces at one stage or another, OPP and obviously Quebec today, most of the provinces at one point or another all had their own forces. In the situation with Alberta, reading up on this, there was an 85% patch over rate from the Northwest Mounted Police. So it's not a problem. There's going to be the odd person who says, I don't want to stay here. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I want to leave, blah, 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 blah. I don't like the new superintendent or commissioner or whatever it happens to be, and they leave. But about 85% usually patch over without a problem. I've talked to our CMP officers, and some of them say, yeah, I don't have a problem with that because they don't like the idea they're going to be placed in Timbuktu or, whatever, sent someplace they don't want to go. I was told one story where you had two people coming out and they said, well, we want to stay in Alberta. We don't want to be moved anyplace else. And they said, no, you're going to be sent where you're sent. So they sent them off to Quebec. And then what they did is they brought 4 people from Quebec who didn't want to leave Quebec to Alberta. That's the federal government for you. That's federalism at work. Okay, so yeah, exactly. So, one of the quotes here was that this Alberta Provincial Police Force gave Alberta the reputation of being the province where gangsters, thieves, etc. went to go to get caught, was the rest of the quote, I believe. And initially there were 48 detachments that eventually expanded up to 100. They had an 80% conviction ratio, which at one point was as high as 89.9%. In 1930, for example, there were 2,954 arrests, 2,492 convicted. Okay, so we have a history of this as well. Now, I was talking with some of the Alberta sheriffs about this as well, and we had a fellow who was a MLA who had also been previously a police officer, who had wanted at one point to have an office right next to mine, Harvey Sinenko, if people remember him, and some do, yes. And Alberta sheriffs talked to him about this because he was near and dear to their hearts. And he was certainly of the opinion that one of the reasons that you had the Alberta sheriffs expanded and turned into a force of 950 sworn members as of now, with 16 stations, was that this was a preparatory step. So that at some stage, if we wanted to switch to an Alberta Provincial Police Force, we had, in a sense, the infrastructure or the apparatus to do so. And here you can see the two different uniforms. You have somebody with the Alberta Sheriff standing next to somebody with the RCMP, giving you an idea what the different uniforms look like. Okay, so once you start getting to the idea of, who's going to enforce the law, like Reagan said, every place has a military. Does it have its own or somebody else's? Well, then we get into the question of what do you do with regard to armed force or soldiers, etc., blah, blah, blah. Well, there's a long history in Canada and Alberta of reserves. And so right now, Canada has around, last 2017 number I have there was 72,000 troops in the whole country. We have bases, Calgary, Cold Lake, Edmonton, Griesbaugh, Wainwright, Suffield, etc. And we have down here some of the cap badges and what have you. So we do have a reserve history. I'll just mentally go back to that slide. It's fine. And what I was going to say about that, since 1711, we've had, say, for example, a reserve in the province of Quebec. It actually laid siege. There were various different reserves. Some of them, there were provincial reserves, actually laid siege to federal institutions in previous situations, believe it or not, and won the battles. So there is a real, yeah, well, okay, yeah. Let's hope we don't have to go there, right? But nonetheless, there is a history of this, and we actually have a reserve, the Lord Strathcona Horse, that was last commissioned in 1957 after Her Majesty became Queen, after taking over from her father who passed away. And so that there was a private reserve even. There was Donald B. Smith, who was in charge of implementing the Canadian Pacific Railway. That was his own private force. So there's all sorts of history and precedent for doing this type of thing. Now, thank you, sir. We go on to some of these other examples of other jurisdictions that have their own forces. So the Louisiana State Guard had 3,000 people who served during World War II, was authorized under Title 32, Section 109 of the United States Code. We have the Alabama State Defense Force, 1,000 people strong, actually sent forces into the Bay of Pigs because he was a staunch anti-communist, and some of the people that were involved in that operation for the CIA or whatnot had connections to the guy who was the leader of the Alberta State Defense, the Alabama State Defense Force. They trained Cuban emigres, and they had secret camps operating in Nicaragua. That's fascinating. South Carolina State Guard, they have 1,015 people currently, secured Florida in the 1800s, and during World War II had 518 officers, 6,035 enlisted men. Oregon State Defense Force, after September 11th, they had 9,268 total served, 1,671 of them in Afghanistan, 7,048 in Iraq. The Kentucky Guard, 100,000, served in the war between the states. Now I want to, we had a former slide presentation talking about the other 69 some countries that have populations smaller than Alberta. What I've done here is I've picked out countries that have populations between 4 and 5 million people, just to give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about. So Moldova had 7,000 forces in 2016. Ireland had 9,000 in 2017, 7,300 regulars, 1,600 active reservists. New Zealand, 4,500 regulars, 2,000 size territorial force, 500 civilians. Croatia, obviously a hot spot, having just come out of a real war scenario, 18,000 forces in 2017. Panama, 26,000 forces in 2017. Okay, Switzerland. Now, Switzerland's a very interesting example, and I want to touch on that. Danny doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to go down another rabbit hole here. I'm adding context to this all, given some of the things that have happened lately. So Switzerland, between 19 and 34 years of age, currently, they have people in their reserves. During the Second World War and at times in their history, they would go up to the age of 50, into the 50s. The regular forces, about 20,000. World War I, they had 220,000 reservists. Okay, in World War II, and I want to point out that the Swiss population was about 4 million. Now it's about 8. But at the time of World War II, it was about 4 million people. In 3 days, they mobilized 430,000 combat troops, 210,000 support, and at their height during the Second World War, they had 850,000 forces, right, out of a population of 4 million. Pretty impressive. So strong that, as a matter of fact, when Goering, who was the Reich air minister for Hitler, approached the Swiss foreign minister and basically said, what would you do if we took 1 million German forces and put them on the Swiss border? He took a shot of schnapps and he said, we'd all have to take 2 shots and go home. Okay, and they were left alone. They were left alone. There's a lot of strength and whatnot to be said about the Swiss in terms of their independence and versus Napoleon, versus Adolf Hitler, et cetera, in terms of having a strong reserve force inside their country. And there's a lot to be said about them. Now, on that note, I want to say this. I mean, we all know, we've heard it talked about this morning, and God bless the people like Andrew Lawton and others for bringing this up. Trudeau is coming up with this thing where he wants to ban 1,500 types of firearms. And I mean, it's egregious what they're doing in terms of violation of property rights, et cetera. If we had an Alberta reserve, okay, I know some members here have participated in something that Switzerland has, known as a Schützenfest. Okay, they have an annual competition for people to participate in rifle competition. Okay, and it's also handgun. But in doing so, right, those weapons, those firearms, right, that you have become part of the reserve, become part of the protection of the property, of the territory. Okay, so if, like the Swiss have the Schützenfest, and it carries on in some other countries, there are Swiss or German populations in other parts of the world that also participate. We actually have a Swiss Rifle Gun Club that operates in Kananaskis country and regularly participates in these things, receives Swiss medals, and fires ammunition provided by the Swiss government, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. I was a member of that club. I have longtime friends from high school who've been in, that for decades and have tons of medals and all that type of stuff. God bless them. If we actually had something like that, okay, you would be able to have a protection for Alberta gun owners from an Ottawa gun grab. So these are some pictures that show some of the history of the Schützenfest. As you see, it's a co-ed thing. Women and men could participate in this. I found evidence of women participating even as far back as 1884, and indeed they could have participated far back before then. Okay, but in doing so, if somebody came to your door, whether it be RCMP or it became somebody with the national forces, et cetera, and they said, hey, we're here to grab one of your 1,500 types of varieties of guns that we don't think you should have because, Justin Trudeau said so. And then you have a certificate that says you're part of an Alberta reserve, okay? And you can say, well, it's not your jurisdiction, frankly. The Premier of Alberta has enacted a notwithstanding clause, and this is a constitutional matter, and, you just, best believe, because this is a legal matter and it's before the courts. So, you have no jurisdiction. Okay. And I just give these as examples because this is something the Israelis have with regard to their combat shooting courses. Okay, obviously, ours would probably not have a Star of David and have the menorah there, but some members might like that. I don't know, but and I have my example here from my own restricted certificate, but. We have the ram's head in Alberta and various things. There's all sorts of symbols you can use. But nonetheless, what I'm saying is that there's a way we can set this up. There's a will. If there's a will, there's a way. There's a way we can set this up so that we're protecting Alberta, we're protecting heritage, we're protecting gun rights, we're protecting our history. And anybody, whether it's Justin Trudeau or it's Blair or Alan Rock in days of yore or Anne McCullen for that matter, traitor to Alberta. Anyhow, if any of these people say, we think we should take your guns or your guns should be destroyed or they should be, et cetera, you can tell them to go to hell. Okay, and I'm trying to set this up. I'm trying to put out ideas there so that we can protect these things and not have them intruded upon and trampled upon by people who, frankly, just don't respect property rights. But anyhow, I think I'm kind of done with that new angle, Danny.
What's the question?
Oh, the question was what I posed at the very beginning, which if you're able to go right back to the beginning. Should Alberta have its own police? That's even tighter than John Robson. Isn't that shocking for a former politician?
I know, yeah, exactly.
Shocking. And you could also say, should Alberta have its own reserve force? Right? I think those are very valid questions. And, we're sending tens of billions of dollars to Ottawa every year in surplus with regard to these transfer payments. This stuff is easily affordable, folks. And if you think that somehow you don't have the royal jelly and the gravitas to make this work, but Justin Trudeau does,
Then you're in
please.
the wrong room.
Yeah, you're in the wrong room. You're in the wrong province. Anyhow, I don't know if there's questions.
Ask if there's a question.
Yeah, are there any questions about this stuff?
Yeah, two.
Yes.
Check.
This is Alberta's gun guy, Todd Brown.
There you
Thank you. I would make an amendment to it if you'd make a comment on it that because of some of the corruption in other provincial police forces, that this should have some sort of civilian oversight.
Yeah. Okay. No, fair enough. Yeah, it's always who guards the guards, right? That's the old Roman question. I don't have a perfect answer to that. I know we have some former police officers in the room who are big fans of Sir Robert Peel and some of his thoughts on policing and how it should be done so that it's not draconian, it's not oppressive, it's not totalitarian, and it's because one of the things is if you have a police force or a military for that matter that is not seen and perceived to be part of the public, then they're not trusted and they're not given information. But if they are trusted and they're seen to be reasonable, then the public will voluntarily give them information about things they think are criminal activities going on, etc. Like one of the things that pained me, and I'm sure you all saw this, was when you had this young fellow Ocean who was out playing hockey in Calgary. And I mean, I'm sure there were a few fellows on the ice, before the police arrived, but then once the police arrived, there was only him. And he's just standing there and saying, what am I doing wrong? What's wrong? He's a kid at Christmas, out playing hockey on the ice. I mean, there's no more Canadian or Alberta thing going than that. And then these police officers threatening to taser him and taking him down. It's ridiculous. And that is exactly the type of thing, whether it's the gun grab at High River or that type of action on behalf of some members of the Calgary Police Service, that is just uncalled for. And that's the type of stuff that makes this all the more plausible when we see those types of things going on. Yeah, that's right. Who gave the orders? Right?
You also missed out that in
Speak up, Daryl. Yeah.
in the fires in Slave Lake, they also went into all the houses and were searching everything. They claimed that they were searching for people, but they didn't have to go through everybody's drawers. I don't know what happened.
Who's hiding in that drawer?
That happened there. Yeah. That may have happened in Fort Mac too, but it seems like the federal RCMP are looking for disasters to do whatever they're search and seizures for absolutely no reason, it seems. So if we don't have our own police force that's ruled by the province, we're always gonna, they're just puppets for their masters in Ottawa, right?
Right. Yeah. I really do believe in having a local police. I mean, I know the John Birch Society in the United States talked about that for a long time because they were suspicious of federal agencies, etc. I'm not going to go there, but I do believe there's really something about them having local knowledge, understanding of the people, the political and demographic climate, etc. This ridiculous example where they had two people who just came out of depot for the RCMP, wanted to stay in Alberta. They were Albertans, and they're like, nope, we're going to send you someplace else. But then they brought in 4 guys from Quebec, and the guys from Quebec would have preferred to have stayed in Quebec. What are we doing? What are we doing? Why are we doing that? Yeah, well, yeah, it's unfortunate.
We have another question here.
I think in Fort McMurray during the fires, one of the fears was exploding ammunition too, with heating up and the houses burning, that some of that could happen. But I mean, that was what you heard on the news anyway. My question relates to the 70% and the 30%. So to my understanding, that 70% of the costs are covered by the province in the current agreement, and 30% is covered by the federal government. If Alberta was to vote and approve and go to their own police force, how would it end up be cheaper if 30% then of the funding of that? I think you addressed it a little bit there with some of the cost savings of bilingualism and some of that, but I'm just curious because that's probably an obvious question people are going to want to know. If we're already getting 30% of funding, how would we cover that and make it affordable?
Well, if somebody wants to whip out a calculator and do 30% times 2,000 times 155 or 170,000, you're going to know the exact number. And then you take that out of $20 billion and you're going to figure out you're going to be saving 19 point something billion dollars, right? So, I mean, that's the reality, right? So, I mean, it's the argument that it's not economical is ridiculous. And if you look at the cost, if you look at the growth, if you will, in the cost of the budgets for the police, it's not coming from frontline stuff. I mean, universities are examples of this. There's all sorts of examples of this. Canada Health. I mean, we've got 3,000 bureaucrats in Ottawa involved with health. Not a single one of them is a doctor who actually delivers a frontline service. That's still done by the province either of Ontario or Quebec. Okay, but we have 3,000 bureaucrats in the Canada Health stuff. So, we're having a bunch of people who are bureaucrats and working in the national headquarters, et cetera. There aren't frontline policing. So what it comes down to is it's a tiny little fraction. It's a rounding error, right? In terms of out of the $19 billion you're going to save to have it done locally. So this idea that, once again, you're not going to be able to fiscally manage a police force here better than Ottawa does, better than Justin Trudeau does, is ridiculous.
We'll take a break. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
To touch on the question earlier, my lawyer has for me what may be a tens of millions of dollar lawsuit against the RCMP, and he's working towards pushing the government, Alberta government, to have a special crown attorney to prosecute criminal cops. And no matter my lawsuit against the RCMP, I maintain that I think we should keep the RCMP. For other reasons, I also think that we absolutely need our own provincial police force. While I was in Afghanistan, some of my friends were training the new Afghan police force, and sometimes they would arrest members of the old police force. And so my concern here and now is that no matter what happens, whether we keep the RCMP or have our own provincial police force, what has to change is the training and or policies around that. No matter who's in power, no matter uniform, no matter what, nothing will change unless policies and training change. And we have people that can supervise that and make that happen, but how do we do that?
I'm going to relate a story because I think it's related. By the way, thank you very much for your service, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had one of my former staffers who served as a liaison officer with the Afghan tribal leaders, so tough neck of the woods. I remember one time I was doing a tour of the Calgary Fire Services, and I was a young upstart politician, politically incorrect as I'm known to be, And so I asked the guys, the chief and others who were there, I said, out of curiosity, do you guys ever get messed with in terms of political correctness? Are you ever forced to spend money on some stupid stuff, et cetera? What goes on? And they kind of looked around at each other and then looked around the room and checked everything out. And they said, why are you asking? And I said, well, because, all the time as a new MP, I'm running to this stuff in Ottawa where, I have people come to me and they're asking, it's March Madness. We're coming to the end of the budget. Do you know people who want to get windows or this and that? Just send us whatever, we'll fund it. It doesn't matter, et cetera. We had one lady who was looking for complaints with regard to different numbers of people in terms of ethnic minorities or women working in workplaces, and if we knew any businesses that were offside with whatever their quotas were and stuff like that, and she was looking to create work for herself, and I said, do you put up with any of that type of stuff? Does that go on? Once again, they looked around, and they realized there was nobody else. There's no NDP or whatever in the room, and they said, well. And they said, we were told that the Calgary firefighters weren't diverse enough. That I'm sorry, I'm not checking. There weren't enough women, there weren't enough ethnic minorities, blah, blah, blah. So we have to do more. So they said, you have to take the amount of money, $50,000 plus that would cost, to hire another firefighter to save another life, to climb up a ladder, to, take a cat out of a tree, whatever. And we had to put that into this diversity recruitment program. And they said, we didn't get any more women, we didn't get any more ethnic minorities, but we squandered the resources of hiring another competent firefighter. They said, what the hell was the point of that? And to talk to this training, he said, once upon a time in the police forces, in the fire services, right, you did a flexed arm hang because it indicated how much upper body strength you had, whether or not you could climb a ladder or take a 100-pound or 200-pound person, carry them down a ladder up and down, whatever. It was simple, it was easy. Nowadays, no, you can't do that, right? So now you got to have the exact size hose with the exact size pressure and, all this type of stuff. And you have to, you go to this tremendous cost to create this training that the old training, which is a simple old flexed arm hang, did, but now you got to spend all this bazundles of money, right, to do this training because of human rights concerns. So I'm very much based on the idea of merit. And I think a lot of times we overthink the stuff and we just go down rabbit holes we don't need to with regard to this. And so you need to obviously have some good people, whether it's people who are minded like Sir Robert Peel was with regard to policing, or, some people that you really trust with regard to setting up a reserve force or what have you. They exist, and no nonsense, and do a good job of it. My answer. But anyhow, thank you very much, Danny.
Thank you, Rob.
And I want to say, Danny, I'm not sure he'll ever get the credit that he deserves with regard to the future of this province and what all you've done, sir. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So David, you're going to put up the Slido and the one question. Let's put up the question: should Alberta have its own police force? And you can go to Slido. You can vote on that over the course of vote on that while we're having a break. So we're taking a break from 3 till 3:30, and after 3:30 we'll be talking about. Josh Andrus will be talking about Project Confederation, and Brian Hildebrand will be telling us the devil is in the details, which I think we were all starting to surmise. So let's take a break. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Michelle. Take a break, gang. Yep. Okay, folks, I know the day is starting to wear on and everyone's getting a little bit, we're all looking forward to the end of the day. Okay. Okay, Maxime. Okay, we're ready to go. Thank you very much, everyone. We're gonna do a poll question right off the bat here. Do you support the Alberta government in creating a provincial police force with an elected civilian oversight? How many people have voted so far? 96% of the ones that have voted yes, but as we're, can you see how many people? Oh, 55 people have voted already. Holy smokes. Well, everybody's at the room. There's you go to slido.com, you put in that event code, tell us what you like. And as I said, the other thing you can do is ask questions if you want to anticipate some questions for our upcoming speakers, or if you've had some questions from before, put them there. And I think one of the ways that Slido is supposed to work is once you see the question, if you like the question, you can click like, and then later on today, and well, not today, we're not going to get to any questions today. What's it say, David? But in any event, yeah. But what will happen when the questions are there, you can click if you like them, and then there we are. So if you click if you like them, then we'll see which questions people like the most, and we'll get them answered before we leave here. So here we are. It's 3:30. Our next speaker is one of I would say one of Alberta's up and coming thought leaders, and he's from Project Confederation, and he's Josh Andrus. So please welcome.
Well, to start, thanks to Danny for putting on this wonderful conference year after year. And thank you to all of the illustrious presenters for adding such valuable insight that we will absorb over the course of the weekend. For those of you who are unfamiliar with who we are, my name is Josh Andrus, and I am the Executive Director of Project Confederation, which is a subsidiary of the Alberta Institute, a federally registered nonprofit think tank. I founded Project Confederation in July 2019 as a response to rising feelings of Western alienation among citizens of Alberta. These feelings are not new to politics in Canada. In fact, they have been a consistent theme throughout the history of this country. And like so many others, I will begin with a brief journey through history, but not too far. I'm not going to take us through a long-winded soliloquy of federal-provincial tensions which date back to the purchase of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1868. I'll leave that to others. I'm just going to take us back a few years to the summer of 2014. It was an interesting summer. Alison Redford had resigned in disgrace, and a leadership race was in full swing for the Progressive Conservatives. At the time, the news was all bustling over license plate slogans, perceived infrastructure deficits, free memberships, and of course, plane dossiers. But there was one story that stuck out to me at the time, and it was a spat over the temporary foreign workers program. Of course, we all remember the good old days, perhaps somewhat bracingly given the current state of affairs. Alberta's economy was booming on the back of record oil prices, which at the time were bouncing off $100. There were more jobs than there were people to work those jobs. And the temporary foreign worker program was seen as a vital tool to bring in trained workers to fill these openings. In mid-June, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Jason Kenney, announced that the federal government would be capping the number of low-wage workers in an employer's workforce at 10%. Of course, given the structure of Alberta's labor force, this was met by hostility from our provincial politicians. The reason I bring this particular story to mind is even that when times are good and people are working, that there are going to be areas in which having more provincial autonomy is a positive for Alberta. And there are those who may scoff at feelings of Western alienation. There are those who believe that an oil price spike back to the $80 to $100 range will fix everything. And there are those who will say that if you vote Conservative, you will be taken care of. A simple walk down memory lane to only 7 years ago shows that Alberta, in good times or bad, needs to have more autonomy over its provincial affairs. And yet here we are. Jason Kenney is now the premier of an embattled province in the depths of a now 6-year recession. I'm quite certain that he has spent many hours pondering his government's positioning vis-a-vis the Fair Deal front that was announced 16 months ago. He's already received stern advice from academics and policy thinkers, many of whom are in this room, business leaders, public sector unions, and of course, those dreaded opposition politicians. In the midst of all of these opinionated thought leaders, I don't want to presume upon you all, but I consider it prudent to add my own voice. Over recent months, I have become increasingly concerned about the slow pace of movement on the fair deal front. I have to admit that at times it is difficult to recognize that this government's front of mind issue is a COVID-19 pandemic that has dominated both front page headlines and imaginary water cooler conversations across the globe. However, the pandemic has only highlighted many of the reasons why greater autonomy is not a luxury that we can afford to shy away from. There are those on the other side, mainly populated by government sector union leaders, voicing what we can only imagine are the concerns of their well-paid and pensioned members. We have seen over the past year, as pointed out by Franco Terrazzano at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, our public sector expand while our private industries have been decimated. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Albertans are either underemployed or unemployed and increasingly dependent not on their own hands for income, but on handouts from the government. The people involved in these public sector unions are not particularly worried about our relationship with Ottawa and seem to be more intent on protecting their own interests at the expense of the taxpayers that pay them. We cannot become a province dominated by government employees. Jason Kenney had campaigned to create a free enterprise province, but alas, I have become increasingly concerned with the direction that his government has taken. That being said, and I may be concerned with provincial government actions, I am nothing short of alarmed regarding the behavior of the federal government. We have seen no concrete action regarding the Biden administration's disastrous decision to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, killing thousands of jobs on both sides of the border. I am aware of the legal efforts that the provincial government has made regarding fighting this grave economic decision. However, without the support of Ottawa, these efforts are unlikely to succeed. There is absolutely no assurance that similar instances will not mar federal-provincial relations in the months and years ahead. I would even argue the reverse, that they are inevitable. This doesn't necessarily have to be the case. As the Premier and head of government, Kenney has many tools at his disposal in order to create a firewall around this province and to help prevent the federal government from crushing our already beleaguered economy. I've seen much chatter in recent months opposed to the fair deal efforts the provincial government has, to their credit, at least begun to undertake. Since then, however, we have seen even more animosity from our eastern allies than we did before. Even in our darkest hours, while we struggled to deal with a surge in COVID-19 cases in the winter, we were ridiculed by eastern academics and politicians. The most egregious of insults was hurled our way by University of Ottawa professor Amir Ataran, who suggested that the federal government not help Alberta in the fight against COVID-19 and called our struggles cocky failure. Was he met by derision from the federal government? No. Crickets. This provincial government must guarantee to themselves and to us, their citizens, that they will do everything they can to protect us from an ignorant and hostile government in Ottawa. In no other way can this province begin to regain hope and begin to rebuild. We need firewalls around us to help cushion the blow of the federal government dedicated to destroying our livelihoods. And I'm sorry that this is the way it must go. I was born Canadian, loud and proud. I wore that maple leaf on my sleeve while I watched our countrymen compete in international affairs, from business to politics to athletics to academics. However, the fragmented state of our current relationship with Ottawa has become nothing short of disastrous. For decades, we have been cheated and essentially treated as a colony of the East, forced unwillingly to send billions upon billions of dollars to the rest of the country in the form of equalization. And we don't have the political representation in Ottawa to stop these unfair transfers, as only 34 of the 338 MPs in the House of Commons represent the province of Alberta. It is vital to the future of the province that these abuses stop. We are a province struggling in the face of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and yet Ottawa still sees it prudent to continue to stomp on us. There are two and only two ways to fix this. Anything less would be a profound disappointment, not just to me, but to thousands of people in this province who are being hurt by the unfair treatment of the federal government. First, the government of Alberta must hold a referendum to abolish equalization from the Canadian Constitution. The proposed wording as laid out by the Fair Deal panel is as follows. Do you support the removal of Section 36, which deals with the principle of equalization from the Constitution Act of 1982? According to the Quebec secession reference of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1998, any constitutional resolution passed by any provincial legislature triggers a duty for the federal government to negotiate with the provincial government that holds it, as long as that question is clear. According to the Constitutional Referendum Act and a provincial law, all constitutional resolutions must first be put in front of the citizens in a referendum form. The clarity of the question is vital. Asking to reform or renegotiate equalization are not clear enough questions to trigger the clause, especially when the concept of equalization, but not the formula, is ingrained in the Constitution itself. Second, Mr. Kenney must call on his contemporary premiers to have a constitutional convention in order to work through these issues that we have. On the question of representation, Kenney was first elected as a member of the Reform Party, which fought extensively on the concept of a Triple E Senate. For those of you who are unfamiliar or have forgotten, this means that constitutional changes are required to create an elected Senate with an equal number of senators per province and one that has effective powers. This would effectively create a second arm of government, one that can act as a check on the House of Commons, where 199 of the 338 seats in Parliament are in Quebec and Ontario alone. The Triple E Senate is not a dead letter, or three, simply due to the Supreme Court's ruling that reforms cannot be dictated to them by the federal government. That ruling left the door open for the provinces, through coalition building and hard work, to come to that agreement. It is vital that the government of this province understand that. However, in order for either of these objectives to succeed, the government of Alberta must be taken seriously, which is why the success of my first two recommendations are dependent on the establishment of the firewall initiatives as laid out in the Alberta agenda 20 years ago, and I bet Tom's going to talk about this a lot later. A provincial pension plan is a statement piece that will get attention across the country. As a young working class population, Albertans contribute much more into the Canadian pension plan than we receive in payments. Establishing a provincial pension plan would see premiums drop substantially for our citizens while giving us the ability to maintain benefits as is. Most of the opposition I have seen comes from public sector unions who take the approach, keep your hands off my pension, don't touch my pension. However, the Alberta pension plan, like the Canadian pension plan, must be overseen by a body independent of government decision makers. While I have personally become quite alarmed at the immense exposure to China that the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board has undertaken in recent years, it would be unfair for me to criticize the board as an arm of the federal government. Investment decisions in both cases must unequivocally be independent of the government. A provincial police force is another necessity. It's not a direct financial benefit to Albertans, and there have been some steps in recent months to improve the rural crime problem that has dominated headlines for years. However, the point of the exercise is to build firewalls around Alberta, and having a police force that is provincially run, trained, and operated will allow for policy flexibility that is currently unavailable in a federal force that works from coast to coast. There will be costs, but the current estimates put forth by the RCMP union severely overstates most of the needs, especially when the existing infrastructure would not need to be built from scratch. Now, I'm not arguing that one person or group of people can develop the ideal police force or pension plan, whether that be on a federal or a provincial level. The difference in each case is that the objectives of each organization would be immensely benefited by the localized nature of the organizational design. Decisions would be taken with the citizens of a smaller subsection of people in mind, leading to more focus on a macro level or a micro level rather than a macro one. These fundamental principles are what drives the goal of more autonomy for Alberta, and localized decision making will be an important piece of this province if or when we see economic good times return. It would be argued by some that the firewall objectives are steps in the path of independence, and those arguments are 100% correct. There are objectives within the Alberta agenda, such as tax collecting that Danielle is going to speak about tomorrow, or opting out of federal transfers that were deemed unnecessary by the Fair Deal panel report. However, like Justin Trudeau's inability to be taken seriously as he defends the interests of our energy sector, it is vital to the fair deal stance that Alberta make it clear to Ottawa that we are not to be taken lightly. Failing to enact enough legislation to build enough institutional support for autonomy will inevitably weaken our hand as we head to Ottawa seeking fairness. Failing to enact any of them makes our entire position untenable and unserious. The economic accolades of a province in recent years are fond memories. What is important today is to build cornerstone institutions that will be set up to thrive once we can position our economy in the right way, in whatever form that may take. We owe our past success to the hard work of our blue-collar population who have watched, breathless, a once thriving economy become a global laughingstock. There are many variations of a fair deal that can possibly be achieved, but all tools at our disposal must be in play as soon as possible. Time is of the essence, and as our situation further deteriorates, urgency is required to alleviate the pressure. I can tell by the Premier's demeanor of late that he is getting frustrated with the lack of support he has from those who sent him to Edmonton in 2019. It's important to note that the problems that have existed since 1868 are still ever present in our political conversations today, and that by working to fix these problems, Kenny will undoubtedly find that Albertans will have his back, and that he will not be taken lightly. After all, isn't one of the greatest lessons of politics that through firm belief, dogged determination, an imposing presence, and pervasive oratory arguments that anything is possible? I hope that Mr. Kenny will remember that it was local considerations that influenced past Alberta political icons such as Ernest Manning, Peter Lougheed, and Ralph Klein. When he does, I hope that he does not forget that to do justice for all Albertans is to work on our future for our ends, legislate for our prosperity, and do not bend at the knee to a country that views us as a way to fund their lavish lifestyles. I hope that he will not be influenced by the contemplation of an overwhelming and overshadowing country. We must be ambitious in our aspirations and not apprehensive in our ambitions. It's time that we stand up for ourselves and stop being constantly reminded that we are all subjects of an overreaching government dedicated to crushing our economy and our livelihoods. We can't do this alone. Please join our campaign for a fair deal by visiting our website at projectconfederation.ca. Thank you.
Thank you. We can have a Q&A at the end.
Okay,
thank you.
perfect. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Josh. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of Brian Hildebrand's speech, if Brian doesn't go over time. So Brian, where are you? Where's Brian Hill? Here we are. Thank you, Brian. Brian's been a really good supporter of our organization. He's a farmer from southern Alberta, and I guess if he wants you to know any more about himself, he will tell you, but he's here to talk about the devil's in the details. So thank you for joining us, Brian.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. It's great what you're doing. Appreciate it. Is providing awareness to things that a lot of people aren't thinking about or they should be thinking about. So anyways, a goal without a plan is just a wish. And I think Danny's doing a wonderful job in taking these goals, combining it with a plan so they're not just wishes, so that we can actually accomplish something with it. I told Danny a story the other day about a kid and his mom were having breakfast, and there's a great big commotion in the chicken coop. And Ma says to the kid, well, it has to be Johnny, right? Can't be anyone else but Johnny. It has to be Johnny. And so Johnny, go out there and see what's going on. And so Johnny runs out to the chicken coop, and his commotion carries on, and finally it stops, and he comes out, and he's got a fox in his hands, and the fox is snapping and writhing, and Johnny's just proud of himself. Look, Ma, I got it. And the fox is almost getting out of his hands, not quite. And the realization comes that he doesn't have enough strength to quite finish the job, and that fox is going to get away on him. And this look of horror comes on his face. And Ma says, Johnny, what's wrong? He goes, Ma, please help me let go. So let's make sure we have a plan. So following here are some principles of an organization that you may or may not recognize. A robust civil society made up of free individuals, strong families, and voluntary associations. These are principles, goals of this organization. Freedom of speech, worship, and assembly. Affirming the family is the building block of society and the means by which citizens pass on their values, beliefs, and ensure that families are protected from the intrusion of government. I don't know if some of you are trying to figure out who this is, or you probably know already. Value for economic freedom in a market economy which encourages creation of wealth through free enterprise, protection of the right to own, enjoy, and exchange property. Limited government, low levels of taxation, and help to generate economic growth while allowing Albertans, well, there's a key there, to enjoy the fruit of their own labor. Fiscal responsibility, including balanced budget, debt reduction, and respect for taxpayers' money. Protecting public safety as a primary responsibility of government. And control spending and dramatically reduce the size of government and encourage municipal governments to do the same. But who is that? Who is that? It's the UCP. And that progression from principles, ideals, to what's happening is frustrating, I think, all of us. For sure, conservative-minded people, but it's frustrating all of us. And just over a week ago, I had enough, and I handed my letter of resignation into the local UCP board. And I'll just read a bit of the letter I wrote to them. And it says, I have struggled with putting words together to express what is on my mind over the last months. What has started as an inkling of doubt has now come to a situation where remaining a member of the Tabor-Warner CA board has become an untenable situation. That inkling of doubt began on May 8th, 2018, when the party leader said, I hold the pen, in a press scrum. That was right after that first meeting, the first big meeting there. That statement was a sharp departure from the founding principles by which the UCP was formed through joining the Wild Rose and PC parties. At the time, it was a notable statement which was contradictory to the notion of grassroots that was easy to dismiss as pure phraseology. However, as time moved on, that it has become apparent that who holds the pen in many aspects of the government of Alberta. That iron fist grip on the pen would not be nearly as offensive if the principles by which the party had been founded were being adhered to. Simply, those principles are being ignored at best and aggressively violated at worst. One does not need to look far to see examples prohibiting families from gathering, arresting young people for playing hockey. We've mentioned a bunch of these already today, preventing children from enjoying recreation with their friends, the jailing of a pastor for acting on his calling to serve his God, maintaining large barriers to obtain commercial driver's licenses, centralizing emergency dispatch. We can go on and on and on. There's many, many examples. The course that the party has taken is completely contradictory to its founding principles, principles that are admirable and that should be adhered to with vigor. In fact, it is expected, and that was passed in the same document where those principles are, it is expected that members of the party will support the principles of the UCP. And these principles should be more than just aspirational. They should be ingrained in the culture and the actions of the party and the government, and the government that party forms if it is fortunate enough to gain the confidence of the electorate. The current state of affairs is sad. What the party is professing and what it is doing are contradictory as the regulations that the government is imposing on the population. So as an individual, I still believe in the stated principles of the UCP, that they are to be much more than aspirational. Unfortunately, the party has left these principles behind. And as a result, I feel I have no alternative but to leave the board for the time being. And there's still some board members here actually in the room, and I think there are many good people on the local board, and I wish them all the best to continue in their efforts to make our province a better place. We'll go on to the next one here, and I've read some Seam Tell. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He wrote The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, Fooled by Randomness. And this is just I have a couple of things from a paper. It's an article that he wrote with regards, it's called Political Principia, Political Principles. And maybe this highlights a little bit of the difference or what's going on, and the real difference in politics, and John Robson kind of mentioned this a little bit, right or left, but the real difference isn't right or left. It's Greek or Roman, putting theory above practice or putting practice above theory. And that kind of clicked with me here just the last couple of months. One other thing in that paper that he brings forward, and I think it's kind of important to think this way a little bit, is where you are in the political spectrum doesn't need to be static on all scales. You can be a libertarian on the federal level and a communist in the family level. And that isn't incongruent. And so, Maxine's sitting right in front of me here. And so I have to applaud him for being in a place where, it makes sense. At least in my head, it makes sense. And then on the family level, well, we pool our resources. We work together for a common goal. We don't expect things from people that they can't provide, and we provide for those that aren't able to provide for themselves. We do that on that small scale. And if we kind of follow this principle through a little bit, we start to realize that when you get more intrusive, there has to be more direct influence to whoever is the governing body. And as we get further away, there's less influence, and that's why we have to change these scales a little bit, I think. So in the Canadian system, and we have three levels of government: we have the federal, the provincial, and the municipal governments. And they have defined areas of responsibility. What I notice is that there is quite often an encroachment, a violation of those areas of responsibility. But it only goes one way. I'm thinking really hard where it goes the other way, and I can't. It always goes one way. And I think that's part of the frustration that we're talking about here today, is Ottawa encroaching on Alberta, Edmonton encroaching on the municipality, on the family, on our church organizations. The problem isn't the other way. So what I'm proposing for a question here is that the division of responsibilities for various, want to advance? The division of responsibilities for the various levels of government is to be respected. And any assumption of authority or power by a higher level of government must be limited in scope, be temporary, and be reversible. Agree or disagree?
Thank you, Brian. We have a few minutes for questions at the end. I think that's a wonderful question. I think you make a good case for it. So give him a round of applause, and we will bring that question up and we'll vote on it. So I certainly thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So now we're getting to no disrespect to anybody who's spoken previously, but we're getting to one of the highlights of our day from one of the, speaking of rising stars in the Canadian system, and a fellow who's, I think, younger than most of my kids. So I mean, I certainly am happy to have him here. But I think we all followed Derek's, what would you call it? Your march towards the leadership of the Federal Conservative Party till they threw you out. Yes, and so if I do say so in myself, like if being thrown out of a Conservative Party is like you're in good company, in my humble opinion, because I've been thrown out of a couple of them. But in any event, so without any further ado, I would just like to ask Derek Sloan to come up. He's going to talk about a principled vision for Alberta and Canada, and please do give him a warm welcome. I think he's, like I said, he staked his career to try and create jobs and for our children and our grandchildren. So thank you very much, Derek. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just trying to make my iPad work. It was working all day and up until 30 seconds ago, so not sure why it's doing this here. Yes. All right, let's see here. Yes, okay. All right, well, thank you for that introduction. And Danny never ceases to amaze me with his many quips and jokes and running commentary. And you should write a book someday on that. So you'll remember when I was here before, and I attended various meetings with Danny when I was in Alberta. And you'll remember I told you that no matter what happens, I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to apologize. And I am not going to change or turn track from the values that I believe must be implemented to make Canada or Alberta a great place, the best place it could be. And now you know I wasn't kidding. So I'm sure many of you have questions about what happened to me in the party, and I'd be happy to answer those questions, and I'll take those questions after, but my talk isn't about what happened to me. It's about my vision for the country, and that could be applied provincially or federally. And I say that because in the course of my campaigning and in the course of what I've been doing, I hold the political weight in this country. And it's not so much me, it's the values I stand for, and it's the principles that resonate with people. And so I have a political movement that is strong, and its voice will be heard under, thank you, yeah. And it doesn't matter the color. The parties feel that their brand and their color trumps ideas, values, individual people. But political movements and the strength of movements depends on resolve, courage, and values. And that is what we all have to one degree or another. And my time in politics is just beginning, and I'm just getting started. So, thank you. So I believe that the reason why we are where we are, provincially, federally, is because the other parties in the House of Commons fail to have a proper understanding of the five pillars of society. And I am going to attempt to give you my political philosophy today, the one that I will be promoting across the country in whatever form. But the key to good government in Canada, and by extension, Alberta, is a proper understanding of the individual, the family, the nation, faith, and freedom. And I believe almost every issue we deal with falls under one of those rubrics. And I think that a proper understanding of all of those is the way that we can have good government. So I will go through my thoughts on those five pillars, and I hope that they're instructive of actual real policies that can occur, and many of them I think will resonate with some of the things we've heard today. But I believe that much of the issues we have is because our understanding of these things have been flipped on their head. And that's why we're seeing the problems in the types of laws that are being passed in Ottawa. So we know that the individual is the smallest unit in society. Society is made up of individuals. Society is not primarily groups. It's not primarily genders. It's not primarily skin colors or orientations. It's people. Individuals who have different ideas, values, ability levels, work ethics, talents, values, and approaches to life. And this comes before any group identity. And the mistake that many parties make is to elevate your status in life or your class in life above your individual and God-given distinctiveness. There's no other person on the planet like you, and there's no other person on the planet that can do what you can do and to impact the world the way that you can. So when we treat statistical qualities like your sex or your race or your class as determinative of who you are, this is a lie. And individuals, go ahead, yeah. Individuals have the power of choice, and their individual interests and values and choices matter more than environmental influences. And of course, the environment does influence us, and the way we're brought up does influence us, but they're secondary to our fundamental uniqueness as individuals with freedom to choose. And that freedom can break the influence of environmental exigencies. And because individuals are important, life is important. And all lives matter from the womb until the time when the good Lord takes that person off this earth. Period. And so a lot of the arguments that we have to support, for example, destroying the lives of people in the womb and so forth, is based on the idea that, well, this will make women as a class worse off. And I dispute the idea that having children makes women worse off. But it also is this idea that we're putting a real individual life and person ahead of a class, of a statistical representation of individuals. And if we get back to a proper understanding of individuals, we will come back to a proper understanding of not only rights and freedoms, but a proper respect for life at all ages, of all colors, of all genders. Now, to move to a more, I hope, less divisive issue, individuals ought to be able to keep as much as possible of the fruit of their labor, because individuals are the primary movers and shakers in this world. It is their individual choices that create new inventions, that bring new children into the world, that raise children, that build pipelines, that do all of these things. It is not their race or class that does this, it's individuals. So, for example, high tax levels, 50% tax levels, these are they're confiscatory and they're wrong. So we have to make sure that the tax level that we have is not implemented to create a utopian vision, is not created to, take money from the rich just for the purpose of leveling out income inequality. It needs to be based on primarily the idea of people keeping the fruit of their labor. Now, obviously, we have roads to build, societies to maintain. There needs to be tax. And there's nothing wrong with having fair taxation. So if we want to, for example, prevent large corporations from, sheltering all their money offshore in a way that you or I can't do to make it fair, that's fine. But the idea that taxes should be, on a gradient or in any other way designed to socially engineer society, as opposed to just offering a functional society with reasonable services, is wrong. So, to move on to the next pillar here, individuals, of course, come from families. And even if they have not created one of their own, they came from one, and they have a responsibility to the family. And the family is the base building block of society, and properly run provides for bringing the next generation into the world. And the government cannot do that in any way as good or as cheaply as a family can. We need to have policies that promote family growth, families staying together, all of these things. And unfortunately, in this country and in others, there aren't any institutions that are more undermined than the family, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And, for example, the tax code largely treats people as individuals. There's a few benefits for being married, but it's largely an individual thing. So when it comes to policies related to families and taxation, we need to promote children. I mean, we're in a situation now where we have, I was just watching a TV show the other day where they were talking about all the healthcare costs that the baby boomers are going to be incurring over the next 10 or 20 years. And all these investment ideas based on this. And we have, the NDP and other kinds of parties telling us all this money that we have to pour into this. Well, if we had a birth rate to match the baby boomers who come from an era of high birth rates, but we need to have a high birth rate to be able to pay into the system to match that. And we haven't had that for decades. And so the government wants to replace that by high levels of immigration. But it'd be a lot easier just to create policies to promote childbirth and to increase our birth rate. So I'll give you a few examples of some policies that I've seen around the world. These are ideas, I suppose. But in France, they have income splitting across the entire family. So if you have 5 kids, you can, and 2 parents, you can split your income 7 ways. This is an easy way, and we had a form of income splitting under Stephen Harper, but this is an easy way. The more kids you have, the less tax you pay. In countries like Hungary, they give newlyweds a loan. I think it might be something like $50,000. And for every child you have, a fifth of that loan is expunged. And if you have 5 children, you don't owe anything back. And if you have 3 children, you would owe 2/5 back. So these are simple policies that can encourage families to stay together, to have kids. And this is something that is good for society in many, many ways. And if you think of, I mentioned the tax code, but think of the other things here that work against the family unit. So, and there's many studies you can look at between the relationship between higher birth rates and increased economic activity. And so, and frankly, that's why the government and big business advocate for mass immigration, because bringing in new people is an automatic stimulus to the GDP. Now it has its issues for other reasons, which is why I'm not an advocate of mass immigration. But it is a case in point that just more bodies in the country is a way to stimulate economic activity. So we have flagging birth rates at home. Think of the way that our society typically operates. We now live in a society where we need multiple graduate degrees, at least one, and kids are nearly 30 years old or potentially more before they have their first real job. And of course, at that point, they're under mountains of debt. And housing, depending on where you live, is out of reach. And they're in no psychological mood to have a family. So maybe by the time they're in their late 30s or whatever, they're about ready to do that. But the biological clock for people at that age is less receptive to having children than it would have been 10 or so years earlier. And so people maybe have one child or two children if they can. And of course, our society is structured in a way that, again, is pushing both parents to work hard and be away from the home. And so they can't afford to have more than one or two children at most. So there's many opportunities that we have to encourage family growth. And I think we should look at those, and that should be a part of any provincial or federal mandate. We also have policies that allow for easy dissolution of families. And when I owned my small business, there was many things that I could voluntarily commit to that I couldn't get off the hook for. When I signed my commercial lease for X number of years, there was nothing short of bankruptcy or cause, like if, they did something that gave me cause, there was nothing I could do to get out of that. Nothing. And yet, we allow families to be terminated on a whim. So, obviously, there's times when separation is warranted, but our system of easy, no-fault divorce is destroying families and tearing apart the fabric of our nation. And we know that children who are raised in single-family homes are far more likely to have poor outcomes in life, everything from jail to mental health to lower educational outcomes. And yet we encourage and permit divorce for any and every reason. And I say, if people can voluntarily become committed in commercial matters like people are every day, why can't they become voluntarily committed to a family unit? And so, and of course, family structure, I believe, is more important, and the continuity of families is more important than my 3-year lease that I renewed several times as a small business owner. And of course, we're also permitting and encouraging the destruction of the next generation by funding and encouraging abortion on demand. And there are times, of course, when a woman's life may be at risk during a pregnancy, and a pregnancy may have to be terminated as a consequence of saving a woman's life. But the vast majority of abortions are done out of a sense of convenience, as just another form of birth control. And we promote it. I don't necessarily mean we here, but as a society, we promote it and say it's positive. And that's wrong. Many quote unquote liberal European countries like Germany and others have policies that explicitly depict abortions as regrettable and things that ought to be reduced. They're still legal, but women have to go through counseling or other types of things, and it's limited to certain periods of time and that type of thing. And, in this country, it's touted by almost every party in the House of Commons and frankly by the leader of the Conservatives, as far as I can tell, as something neutral or even positive. And I mean, how can we do that? So, this is a messy subject, but we have to be willing. The fundamental thing for good government is you have to be willing to speak the truth, no matter what it is, right? Whether it's pipelines or whether it's something else. So, the next pillar here of the proper way of thinking about government, or whether it be provincial or federal, is the nation or the province. Okay, and the idea that we live in a post-national world and that there's no Canadian values is false and a dangerous lie. So we come from, I just picked this number out, but approximately 2,500 years of Western and Christian explicitly thought, and it's the bedrock of every liberty we have, every government structure in place, and cannot be excised except at the expense of the nation or the province. And we are a nation, you are a province, we have a distinct nation, and I believe Canada is run better and freer than many, if not all, countries on earth. And of course, there's many improvements that need to be made. But Canada won't stay what we are, and a lot of the problems we have are because of us pretending that we're no different from anybody else, and that our only values are that we have none, or our only value is openness, or whatever, these phrases that we've heard. And, this is cowardice. It's the duty of the federal government to put Canadians first at all times. And, frankly, this doesn't mean that we go out and harm other countries, but it does mean I flew here, and we've all flown before. You put your own air mask on before you help somebody else. And I think that we lost this concept of a distinct nation with a distinct identity. And it's suicidal. So in the concept of nations and provinces and so on, it's the duty of a country to utilize their resources for the benefit of their country. So that is why I have been very vocal on the damage of the Paris Agreement. And one of the reasons that I'm here today is to talk about Bill C-12. And as far as I can tell, I'm the only federal MP that will be voting against this bill, unless some other conservative MPs get the guts to go against their leader, which I hope they do. And Bill C-12, which you may or may not know what that is, and that's because it hasn't been voted in yet, it's just been tabled. Bill C-12 is a net zero by 2050 bill. So, if you thought the Paris Agreement was bad, this is the Paris Agreement on steroids. In fact, it's kind of part of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was kind of the front half of it was different countries would agree to binding targets. And of course, it was really only us and some other foolish countries that actually committed to binding targets. It was in places like China will think about committing to targets. They will stop increasing, or they will think about maybe decreasing come 2030. But the kind of, behind the scenes, or the more ethereal part of the Paris Agreement was this kind of notional aspirational goal of being net zero by 2050. And so the Liberals have not only, fully adopted the Paris thing, but they've said we're going to even legislate this aspirational agreement of the Paris Agreement. We're going to have like 5-year goal, checkpoints where we have to show how we're going to get there and all this stuff. And Aaron O'Toole's supporting this. He's on record as saying that, and there is dissent amongst caucus with respect to this. I know this. But given all that's gone on, Aaron is vested in showing a united front. So I don't know if anyone's going to break ranks, but they ought to, and they should, and you should demand that of your MP. Yeah. So I feel as if I feel like a lot of average Albertans don't even realize this is happening right now. They will once the vote goes in, or the week before, or whatever. But in any event, I just want to, kind of pound the table on that while I'm here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions later about it. But this is a bill that's right now in Parliament, and I believe Aaron O'Toole's rationale is something like, well, at least it's like something we can control. It's not, it's our own targets or whatever. But in any event, it's it's wrong, but it also points out why during the leadership race, I said that we needed to have a conservative position on everything. So, it's not enough to say, the strategy, the political strategy right now for dealing with this type of thing, it comes from this climate alarmist view, okay? And so the strategy the Conservatives have is, listen, it's too thorny to directly contradict this. So we just need to come up with a plan that doesn't actually sewer the country and then hope that the electorate buys it. Well, why don't you just say, listen, the conservative view on climate alarmism is that it's wrong. Okay? And so I said that. I campaigned on that, and I was the only candidate to do that. But it's not that hard to do that, because it may be hard initially, because Canadians have been, the frog cooked in the stew. And apparently I've heard that whole thing is wrong. Apparently you put a frog in water and you turn up the thing, he hops out. But in any event, I like it. It's a good analogy. So, if I just said that today, yeah, there'd be, if I was the leader of a party, a large party, and I just said that today, there'd be a media furor storm for a week or two or whatever. But really, it's not that hard over a period of time to argue this out. I mean, you don't have to, I mean, I just did a 30-minute thing with Patrick Moore just on a Facebook Live there. But you don't have to throw the environment under the bus. You can be very supportive of legitimate conservation. You can admit in principle that the world may in fact be warming. You can admit in principle that we need to, as much as possible, have cleaner emissions if we can, right? But you can also say, listen, here's 30 predictions or 50 or whatever over the last 30 years that have been dead wrong. And they're telling us contradictory things. They're telling us that the world's going to end tomorrow. And meanwhile, we're handing over our manufacturing sector to China, who's doing nothing and is emitting way more than us. So the fact is that we have to have a conservative vision on everything. And the environment is, again, one that we must articulate. And this is exactly, and I said this back in context of the Paris Agreement, and now we have net zero, right? And soon enough, as they realize they're getting nowhere near reaching their goals, they're going to have to ratchet up. Already, I mean, listen, we thought, $50 a ton was bad for the carbon tax. And now they're saying that they're going to raise it to, what is it, $300 a ton? Or I can't even keep track anymore to how high they're saying that they're going to raise it. But this is the type of thing that has to be implemented to try and reach their goals that they have. And so that's why it's absolutely imperative. And what I forgot to say at the beginning is I think one of the reasons why the conservative movement is failing in Canada is that it doesn't have a philosophical basis for why it does what it does. So there's good conservative instincts, and there's a lot of conservative politicians who have the right instincts, and they gutturally react against a lot of these things. But all they can do is put on the brakes a bit because they don't have a separate philosophy to deal with it. So they put on the brakes, and then, Justin Trudeau wins and the train speeds up again. But if you want to slow the train down and turn it in a different direction, you need to have a distinct philosophy on all of these things. So I think that's enough about the Bill C-12, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it later. And I believe we have all the way till 5. Is that right, Danny? And I'm going to leave a full 20 minutes for Q&A. Is that good? Okay. So sorry to be, there's less of a rah-rah speech and more of a foundational speech, but I just really want to, outline what I think must happen from any government, whether it be federal or provincial. So the other thing which is foundationally important, and I think instinctively important to many people, but again, we need to hammer this out. And so the fourth principle here is faith. And there's nothing more important to a country than faith, but it's also a very obscure subject. And so there's all sorts of different phrases we've all heard. For example, we may have heard this is a Christian country, or we may have heard don't mix religion and politics, or separation of church and state, or this isn't us, but one nation under God. I mean, there's so many different, popular phrases about faith and religion, and many of them are contradictory and all of them are misunderstood. And so I should start by saying that I believe strongly in a formal separation of church and state. It is a foundation of a free society. And any time that has not happened has been a backstep in freedom. But that concept has been butchered and misconstrued. So to go into this, and I know I'm preaching to the choir in a sense here, but I feel it's important to say, the common understanding amongst an average person on the street, probably not in Alberta, but somewhere else, is that Christians are responsible for the combination of church and state, and that by the gradual onset of reason and secularism, we have put the church in its place. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, most ancient societies, and for the bulk of history, had no distinction whatsoever between church and state. And to this day, many countries do not. And it was Western societies that invented the separation of church and state. And in fact, the most serious types of Christians, like Puritans and Baptists, paved the way and fought for the First Amendment in the United States, which is the most explicit and formal separation of church and state in the world. And if you don't believe me, listen on. I'm going to prove it. So for most of Canada's history, nearly 100% of Canadians identified as Christian. Even today, slightly under 70% of Canadians, 65, depending on which year you're looking at, identify as Christian. The United Kingdom is formally a Christian nation, and the monarch formally swears to uphold the gospel of Jesus Christ, amongst other things. We have a formally Christian monarch here. The founders of our country, of course, were Christian. Many of our national mottos and emblems and so forth are drawn from biblical themes. The structure of our governments were modeled in many ways from Alfred the Great and on the Bible. And so we have words like minister, ministry of this, minister of that. This is the degree to which Christendom is inextricably wound into our culture. So whether you like it or not, it's a fact that Canada is a Christian country. And of course, as a culture, it's a lapsed Christian culture. But our foundational structure is Christian. It's just a fact. It doesn't mean we're all Christians, but it's a fact. Now, Canada has never had an established church and should never enforce or penalize people based on their faith or lack of faith. But to deny the importance of faith, of accountability to God, of the supremacy of God, written into our very charter in those words, is historically revisionist, and it's also unwise. Now, there's much to be said on this, but the invention of the separation of church and state, the inventor of religious toleration, was Christians. And in ancient cultures, the rulers of the country often were gods. So, whether Caesar or Pharaoh, there was no separation between priestcraft and statecraft. And that is why early Christians were thrown to the lions. It wasn't so much that their religion was different, but that they were unable to acknowledge Caesar as Lord over all. So if you remember some of the similar Christian creeds that many of us have heard, you may have heard, there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. That was a revolutionary statement in Rome, because your one Lord had to be Caesar, and that was the phraseology of what you had to say. And it was the way of things for thousands of years to have the ruler of a nation be the direct representative of God on earth to the nation. And therefore, religious dissent was impossible because it became simultaneously treason to the state. And it was the Bible, the ancient Hebrew culture, that firmly established a separation of priestly and state duties. So the Bible tells the story of several kings who attempted to perform priestly duties and were stricken with terrible punishments, with leprosy and other things. Christ's statement, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's, set the stage for our future advance in the West with the revolutionary idea that what was owed to God was separate from Caesar and not the same thing. Now, it is true that the formal establishment of Christian churches where and when it occurred was a negative and a detraction from liberty. And it is still true, but even then, it was still true that the Christian West was more free than other areas at similar times, by and large, and led the way in developing free institutions. And it was, of course, the most serious and ardent Christians who enabled the development of a true separation of the established church in the modern world. And this is the thing that just beguiles the secularists. It was Oliver Cromwell who instituted, and this is the Puritan, protector of England, a rigid, pietistic Puritan. And listen, there's pros and cons to Oliver Cromwell, but with regards to religious toleration, he instituted, for his time, the most profound and lasting religious toleration edicts, far ahead of any other country. The Puritan pastor, in fact, I meant to look this up and I didn't, and his name is escaping me, but his first name was Roger, and he founded Rhode Island. Yes, thank you. He established the first state in the world with full religious toleration and no established church, and that was in the 1600s. And it's also clear, and there's a good book on this, and I can share it with anybody who wants to know, but there's good scholarship surrounding the creation of the First Amendment in the United States, that it was the Baptists and other dissenting, strong, fundamentalists, or whatever you want to call them, that were crucial in pushing forward this, in crystallizing a formal constitutional agreement to not establish a specific church. And the reason for all of this is because if any specific church has the ear of the state, whether it formally, whether it be Anglican or any other, it inevitably becomes corrupted. And even though we have no established church in Canada, so that's on one side. And this is, having said all of this, it doesn't mean that Canada can't generally encourage and celebrate our faith history and our faith past. We can and should. And at no time should we legislate a religious observance, but people should be free to engage in them as they see fit. And the idea today that freedom of religion requires us to sanitize all of our expressions of faith to make others feel better is foolish. If you don't want to pray, don't pray. But if someone wants to offer a prayer at a council meeting or any other place, that should be celebrated. And if someone wants to not pray, that's their business. And our inordinate focus on secularism has turned secularism, and again, this isn't us, but our society has turned secularism into a new religion. And frankly, there's abundant secular religions. There's climate alarmism. There's all forms of fundamental, ardent belief systems that basically masquerade as religions, but people don't even know any better because they don't even believe in religion, and yet they've been duped into buying into these new secular religions. And I say this because there's no true neutrality. So the state has to stand for some type of values. And, when you consider the liberal summer jobs grant there of 2 years ago that specifically excluded people who disagreed with the Liberal Party of Canada's stance on abortion, that is providing or not providing government services based on someone's religious beliefs. And these are the very things that secularists claim, Christians want to do or would do. And it's happening more and more under secularist watch. So we have to remember that the state can't be neutral. It can be hopefully as neutral as possible in providing services, but it needs to have a vision. It needs to have values that guide its actions. And Canada ought to be proud of its Christian heritage and faith history and should of course offer government services irrespective of faith. But this would bring a historical richness and beauty into cultural life in Canada. And I came across the words of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, who said, "Men must choose to be governed by God or governed by tyrants." And my addendum to that is, given our attempts at throwing God to the side, I will let you judge whether the latter has come to pass or not. And given the province I'm in, I think I know the answer. Let's move on to freedom. And this is another term that is frankly probably as misunderstood as faith. As misunderstood as is the term faith. Because every party in the House of Commons claims to be a vigorous defender of the charter rights of speech and conscience and all these things, and yet they're abjectly failing to do so in every single way. We have legislation up soon that basically will, Andrew Lawton alluded to it earlier, but basically will enable big tech giants to censor, as if they needed any help or encouragement. And this is problematic. And really, we're moving in a direction where if you don't have the right beliefs, you're ostracized and penalized in every possible way. And we're moving to have more strict, human rights violations and punishments with respect to this. And we have to be exceptionally concerned about these things. And frankly, which is why we need to move towards American-style free speech protection. Period. We don't need to do everything like Americans do, but that is a bedrock. And I wrote out a few things, for example, about hate speech, which is a very problematic concept from a legal perspective, because. Well, for one, if you look at what the average person thinks hate speech is, it can mean almost anything. And the problem is that because of that, even though judges are more disciplined than the average person, when you have, activists and sort of a decay in the style of respect for freedoms and our education and all that, you inevitably start moving towards hate speech just being things you don't like. And that's what the average person actually thinks it is. Like I was reading I happened to save a student newspaper from about 10 years ago that troubled me at the time. but this was going on, a decade ago, if not multiple. And it was at a university in Ontario, and some Christian group on campus had a day for praying for people in the LGBT community, praying for them to find Jesus or something like that. And the newspaper article was all about how this was all hate speech because it didn't, fully accept and value and all this type of thing. And that was just the opinion of the students and all that. But the fact is like that's 10 years from now. So some of those students are now quasi-prominent lawyers in the almost mid of their careers, and within 5 years, some of those students may very well be appointed as commissioners or judges and things like that. I mean, this is what we're dealing with, and when we have these vacuous concepts, and I mean, I'm just not sure what it means. I mean, if I say I hate you, is that hate speech? If I tell you that you ought to hate someone, is that hate speech? I mean, if it's saying false things about a person or a group, that group, I mean, there's slander, there's libel. We have legal remedies for that. If it's saying threatening things against a group, that's already breaking criminal law, right? So I'm not going to go into that more, but every single one of our freedoms is under attack, and particularly now during COVID. I mean, the freedom to open a business, right? I mean, the freedom to post something informative about COVID on Facebook, I mean, it's crazy. The attack to our freedoms is immense. And what we're seeing now with COVID is a prelude to the degree to which government is just cramping down on our freedoms. I mean, they can, I mean, with the good doctor here earlier was saying, I mean, they can create the rationale for continuing this, what they're doing now, indefinitely. I mean, there's always going to be a variant. Am I right? There's probably 1,000 of them right now as we speak. Yes. So, I mean, this is critical. This is a critical period. And, the silence of the parties in the House of Commons on this issue, what's going on with COVID and the resulting loss of freedom, is deafening. And it's shameful. So, the attack on our freedoms is immense. And, the other part of freedom, of course, is dealing with our justice system. And we're seeing a breakdown of law and order, and that relates to some of the other pillars that I spoke to before. But we have to rethink the way that we're doing our justice system. And I have been challenged lately by reading some things that propose a model that for many crimes, nonviolent property crimes and so on, would be based on a system of restitution and potentially even corporal punishment, but in many ways reducing the incarceration levels so we don't have groups of people being trained to enter a professional criminal class because of their time in, criminal university, jail and other things. On the other hand, we need to have more serious punishments for heinous crimes. So first-degree murder, sex trafficking. These crimes need to be capital crimes. We need to send a clear signal. Thank you. Of course, living in a free society means the right to own firearms and the right to defend yourself. So I'm going to move very quickly to closure so we can do questions and answering. But, I just want to say that, and maybe this will come up in the questions and answers, but these are the type of values that we need to push for. And this is the type of thing that we need to encourage. And I have been marshaling, there are many hundreds of thousands of people across the country that are on the same wavelength as me, probably even millions, but there's hundreds of thousands of people that follow me and read my emails and do things that I ask them to do. And we've been making waves. I mean, I encourage my followers to become delegates to the Conservative Convention to push for policies like this. And we've been doing very well. And there's a whole who's who of high-level establishment conservatives that haven't been able to been elected delegates because people that I encouraged got involved. So we have people like the Ontario PC Party President, Brian Patterson, Ontario Education Minister, Stephen Lecce, former PMO Deputy Chief of Staff, Jenny Byrne, Conservative Fund Chair, James Dodds, former Senator Irving Gerstein, Mark Mulrooney, the son of the Brian Mulrooney. And you know, I guess I can't prove that I caused this, but I can tell you that many hundreds of people who believe just like what I do are going to be delegates at this convention. And it's not about the convention. It's about when you have a movement of people who are ready to go, it's a beautiful thing. And we're ready and we're waiting to throw our support behind legitimate political initiatives around the country. And it's exciting. And I've recently joined, I was a founding member of an End the Lockdowns Caucus, which is a and it is a sort of a multi-level caucus. Anybody who's former or current municipal, provincial, federal politician or party leader, and Maxime Bernier is here, and he was also a founding member. And we're 50 strong. I mean, it's growing every day. It's probably more than that now. But we are working to end these draconian lockdowns, and I think we're getting some great traction. So, in any event, what we need and what to sort of work on all these things after I was ejected from the party, I started a not-for-profit political action group, SPAC, Sloan Political Action Coalition. You can learn more about that at my website. But I'm using that to fund all the initiatives that we're doing. We're making a big difference. And we have the color and party affiliation and all that. Aside from all of that, we have a movement here that is growing and is sick of the status quo. A movement made up of those who are willing to do whatever it takes to implement a government that is true north, strong, and free. True to independence, true to freedom, true to the family, true to responsibility. And exactly how that will manifest itself in the future is not yet clear. But what we need to do is commit today that we will never stop, quit, or backtrack until the style of government that we believe in to you today, that we have spoken about today and tomorrow, is the norm in this country and established from sea to sea. Never apologize, never back down, always move forward, never backwards. God bless you and God bless Canada.
Thank you kindly, sir. No, it's fine. I think we can see, yeah, go ahead, Mark. We'll give you the first question since you're we've got a few minutes for questions and we got about 12 or 14 minutes to keep us on schedule. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Appreciate that speech. You're saying a lot of the things that I know a lot of folks want to hear and don't hear it too often. The idea around freedom, property rights, saying no to the Paris Accord, the climate change narrative.
Come on, Mark. We know what he's saying. We just heard it. You ask us his question.
And it's coming.
Okay.
But we know where all of these issues are connected to the Sustainable Development Agenda, the UN Agenda 2030, all of them. It's an attack on Western civilization and what we've established to this point. That agenda from the Conservative Party since 1992 has been supported by that party. Signed on in 92, brought into law in 2008, signed on again in 2015. My question then to you is, how will you pull that party that's been committed to this nation-destroying agenda away from that?
Well, I'm not a member of the Conservative Party. I'm fully divorced in every way, so I don't claim responsibility for them, and I don't claim the ability to reform them. Although the political action that I've been doing lately has been very helpful, and I don't have final numbers, but it many delegates went to this convention. And frankly, if I wanted to, I could probably focus on reforming EDAs and other types of things. I mean, these types of things are embedded deeply in all parties, and they don't have the discernment to see it. So it involves either a new movement or a wholesale reformation of the existing Conservative Party. But I don't speak for them, and I'm not responsible for what they do, and it's a liberating feeling. So.
I wonder if you could comment on your expulsion from caucus. It was presented over what was really a kind of a trivial clerical error.
Yeah.
It obviously, was it just because you were such a pain in the ass to the leader, or anyway, could you comment on what really was going on there?
Sure. And obviously this is my best take of things. I mean, who knows what was going on in the minds of the leadership, but there was obviously people who wanted me gone from the very beginning, throughout the leadership and after, a small percentage, but some. I believe it was my advocacy leading into the convention that really sort of turned the tables on me. My belief is that Erin O'Toole wanted this convention to come quickly and quietly, without any newsworthy events whatsoever happening around it. And it wasn't advertised very well. And so I started advertising it in mid to late December, before most people had no idea that it was even coming. And the reason, and again, this is all my opinion, but I believe it. So just, if you have an election and you lose, you're up for mandatory leadership review at the next convention. So it's in his best interest to have that convention immediately in case an election is called. But he obviously, given his stances, he doesn't want anything too, for lack of a better word, conservative or controversial. So in any event, I started pushing for this, and I was getting tons of people signing up, and so I don't think they liked that. And in fact, it started to raise the ire of other caucus members, because there was people who would say, man, I had my 10 delegates picked out, and all of a sudden there's 30 more people that want to be a delegate. And I said, well, sorry that your membership wants to get involved democratically in the party. Sorry that you were not able to control that process and handpick. So it did increase the amount of people who there was always a small amount of people who didn't like me. That increased it. I did send out, I sent out a couple of fundraising emails, one for my own EDA and one for the leadership, which my list of supporters is across the country. So there's going to be Conservatives in different ridings that were donating to me rather than to their local people. So there's no rule against it, but that raised the ire of some people. But what it really was, I believe, was I think with everything that was happening down south at the time, was making Erin, they basically didn't know what to do. Like, how do we distance ourselves from conservatism down south? And then all of a sudden this white supremacist thing comes up, and it, combined with probably some people whispering in his ear that I needed to be gone for several months. And it created him to make his public statement. Now, which, was a public doubling down. And so in the caucus, by far the majority of caucus was saying, listen, this is awful. I can't explain this to my constituents. Others would say, my longtime volunteers, the chair of my board is calling me furious. How do I explain this? And, but they were stuck between, okay, we either make Erin O'Toole look foolish and make Derek an ongoing story for weeks and months coming into a potentially soon election, or we end the story now. And so that's what they decided to do. But really, at the base of it, it was, I was throwing my weight around too much, in my view, and it irritated some people, and they took advantage of that.
Good answer. One more question, and then it's supper time. Yep. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thank you. While you were speaking, I took a few moments to email my member of parliament, who is a Conservative, or is the shadow minister for, or the critic, I guess, for natural resources. So I would certainly hope that they would be voting against C12, but just asked for her to speak to me about her stance on that. I know there's only a few of us in the room here that can do that, but there's lots of people that are tuning in online that I would suggest following the lead that you've done there to email your local members of parliament and find out where they stand, because if we don't take that time to reach out to them and let them know that the people they represent want to know where they stand on that, or even if we're opposed to that, to make our voices heard, they may succumb to the pressures of the leader to vote in favor of it.
Yeah, you should do that. Absolutely.
I just did
Yes.
it, and that's
Yeah.
why I said I would
Yeah.
hope others do. Like I say, it took me
Yeah.
a few minutes to find her email address, and yeah, thank you.
And I'm just going to quickly say, so the donation had nothing to do with this. It was a pretense for executing what happened. Yeah.
I want to follow up with kind of what Tom was getting at. I mean, it's bad enough that you got treated the way you got treated, and we all understand that. And I feel your pain, and so does Max, and there's a bunch of people. But Pierre Poilievre, we all know that he got a kick in the pants, and you know, it wasn't. I don't think it was right what he did to you. But then, what's up with the Pierre thing? Like, I mean, is he literally getting rid of people he thinks are going to challenge him if he doesn't win the election, or what?
I think, I've heard this many times. Aaron, so they want to pick up more votes in the 905. That's like the Toronto suburb area. They want the soccer mom to vote for them, and they've used that terminology. In their view, Pierre is too kind of brash and rough to appeal to the soccer mom. And although, frankly, I've met a lot of soccer moms who you know, it's a mythical creation, but in any event, so I think, frankly, his penchant for like sort of being safe and not, taking any risks, not stirring the waters in any way, I think led to him to try and de-emphasize Pierre a little bit. There may be a little bit of, concern. I don't think it was primarily based on concern that Pierre was going to, take him out or something. But I think it was just, again, he believes that softening the image and making the party as unobjectionable as possible to any and all people is the way to stick out and win an election. Yeah.
Let's call that good. Time will tell how that works, won't it? Yeah.
Well, we're already seeing how it's working. No one knows, and no one knows him, and no one cares. Apparently.
Last question.
One
Go ahead,
quick question. Have you any thoughts of joining the PPC and Max?
Well, I've enjoyed.
Before, I just. It's not my question, but it's a very great question. And Derek, our doors are widely open.
Thank you. So I've enjoyed working with Maxime in the End the Lockdowns caucus, and I hope to continue working with him. The exact shape of how things play out in the future is yet to be determined, but I believe. Listen, I think that Maxime's goal is to make this country a better place, aligned with mine. I think we will be working together to do that. But as to anything further, I can't comment on that. So thank you.
That's good. Let's. I think that's a pretty happy note to end on for supper. And so, what a wonderful. Thank you very much, Derek. That was wonderful. It's been an amazing day, and it's been an absolute wealth of speakers. And I don't envy the person that has to follow all these great speakers. But anyway, Maxime's a big boy, and he's going to be doing it in about an hour and a half or 2 hours. So let's take a break. We'll have supper. We'll be back here at 7:30, and we'll see if they've cemented their partnership. So thank you, everyone. Everyone at home, we'll be back at 7:30, and we'll hear Maxime answer Derek's questions. Okay, thank you, everyone.